Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are dialing in from. Welcome to the first C2ES webinar of the new year, moving forward with international carbon markets post-Madrid. I'm Elliot Derringer, the Executive Vice President of C2ES. Before diving into our topic, I just would like to offer a brief advertisement for our upcoming Climate Leadership Conference 2020, taking place March 4th through the 6th in Detroit, Michigan. We have a great lineup of speakers. I encourage you all to check out the agenda at climateleadershipconference.org and hope to see many of you there. I am very pleased today to be joined by four speakers who were deeply involved in the carbon markets discussion leading up to and in Madrid. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will be presenting. We'll hear first from Kelley Kizzier, Associate Vice President for International Climate at the Environmental Defense Fund, then Ambassador Franz, Head of International Affairs Division in the Federal Office for the Environment in Switzerland. We'll then hear from Mandy Rambharos, Article 6 negotiator for the Government of South Africa. And finally, Dirk Forrester, President and CEO of IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association. As many of you know, the failure to agree on rules for implementing Article 6 of the Paris Agreement was a major disappointment at COP25 last month in Madrid. To set the stage for today's discussion, I'd like to set that outcome in the broader context of the Paris Agreement and Paris Rulebook. We often refer to Paris as a hybrid agreement, as it combines both bottom-up and top-down elements. It is bottom-up in the sense that countries' individual commitments are self-determined. They are known as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. The agreement is top-down in the sense that it establishes common rules to provide transparency and accountability, including rules for how parties should account for and report on the implementation and achievement of their NDCs. The Paris Agreement recognizes that parties will engage in international cooperation, including through different forms of emissions trading, in implementing their NDCs. Indeed, many countries have said in their NDCs they intend to use market-based approaches. Article 6 of the agreement contains two basic provisions with respect to market-based approaches. Article 6.2 says parties engaging in emissions trading must apply robust accounting in order to avoid double counting of traded units. And the rules for implementing this accounting provision are meant to plug into the broader set of rules addressing parties' accounting of and reporting of their NDCs. The second provision, Article 6.4, establishes a new centrally managed mechanism to generate tradable emission units, similar to the existing clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. We're going to focus today primarily on the issues surrounding the Article 6.2 accounting provisions. Many of you will recall that at COP24 in 2018 in Katowice, parties adopted the so-called Paris Rulebook, spelling out the detailed procedures and guidelines for implementing the Paris Agreement. They were unable to agree, however, on the rules for implementing Article 6. Parties tried but failed again last month at COP25 in Madrid, and they will try once more at COP26 this November in Glasgow. It's important to note, however, that parties are free to move forward with the use of market-based approaches, even in the absence of these detailed implementing rules. Towards the end of the Madrid conference, a group of countries issued the San Jose Principles for High Ambition and Integrity in International Carbon Markets. These principles outline what these 31 countries believe Article 6 rules should accomplish in order to enable the highest possible mitigation ambition in implementing the Paris Agreement. These principles could also serve as an important reference point for countries acting on their own in the absence of more detailed rules under Paris. So among the questions we are exploring today is how the international carbon market is likely to continue evolving pending further efforts to negotiate Article 6 rules under the Paris Agreement. Our speakers, Kelley Kizzier will provide an overview of the issues and state of discussion coming out of Madrid. Franz Perrez and Mandy Rambharos will provide two country perspectives on the issues going forward, and Dirk Forrester will offer a private sector perspective. All of you listening in will have an opportunity to submit questions following the presentations via the chat box on your screen. With that, I'm going to hand things over to Kelley to get us started.
Thanks. You can go to the next slide. Thank you, Elliot. So I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of Article 6. I think Elliot's kind of gone through it, but I'll do it through slides. So a brief overview, the issues that were open going into COP25 in Madrid and what we accomplished in Madrid. We did accomplish some things and what this means. So Article 6 has three operative paragraphs, 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8. And by operative, I mean paragraphs that parties are working on a rule book for. Article 6.2 is largely seen as a general accounting framework for international cooperation through carbon markets. It provides for the use of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or IPMOs. Sorry about the jargon. I'll try to avoid it throughout, but you need to know the word IPMOs, towards nationally determined commitments, or NDCs, under the Paris Agreement. For Article 6.2, parties have been developing guidance on robust accounting, but the guidance also includes other elements like environmental integrity, sustainable development, transparency. So it's not just accounting, it's largely accounting, but there are a lot of other elements. I think it's really important, because you'll see it throughout the 6.2 text if you ever wanted to read it. The authorization of the parties involved is required by the Paris Agreement in Article 6.3. This is just good governance. A party can't count an IPMO that has not been authorized, and by the same token, a transferring party is not expected to account for an IPMO it has not authorized. In Paris, the decision accompanying the Paris Agreement, 1 CP21, says that double counting will be avoided on the basis of a corresponding adjustment. So for those following Article 6, I'm sure you've heard the term corresponding adjustment, and that's just our tool for avoiding double counting. Essentially, it means that the transferring party adjusts their emissions upwards, and this reflects that they're not going to use the IPMO towards their own NDC, and the party using the IPMO adjusts their emissions downwards to reflect that they sourced the reduction elsewhere. And because those adjustments correspond to one another, double counting is avoided. You don't have two parties using the same mitigation or emission reduction. Article 6.4 establishes a new UNFCCC mechanism. This is a central mechanism like those we saw under the Kyoto Protocol, the Clean Development Mechanism, JI. Of course, it's updated to reflect the context of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement stipulates that Article 6.4 mechanism will be supervised by a body established by the CMA. So not dissimilar to the CDM Executive Board. And for Article 6.4, parties are developing rules, modalities, and procedures. And then finally, we have Article 6.8. Here, parties are defining a work program for a framework for non-market approaches. And we're not going to focus much on 6.8 today. So if you go to the next slide. So as it turns out, accounting for international cooperation through carbon markets, given the diverse set of NDCs that we have under the Paris Agreement, is technically really complicated. There were a lot of open issues going into the negotiations in Madrid. These included a range of issues related to avoiding double counting on the basis of corresponding adjustments. So accounting for non-greenhouse gas IPMOs. And I think the question there is, how can we account for IPMOs that are quantified in terms of kilowatt hours, for instance, or renewable energy inputs? This is a really important issue for a lot of parties because many of the targets defined in the NDCs are not defined in greenhouse gas terms. Then we have accounting for single and multi-year targets. That's a hugely complex issue. As it turns out, single-year targets, which is what we have in most of the NDCs, not all, but most, are not very consistent with the way that carbon markets work. So the accounting system needs provisions to better align single-year targets with multi-year trading. Accounting for sectors and GHGs not covered by the NDC, Article 6 nerds took to calling this the inside-outside issue. And it's an issue closely connected to the Paris Agreement obligation on progression of NDCs in terms of ambition and scope. And then we had issues related to accounting for non-UNFCCC compliant systems. In other words, CORSIA. So if an airline uses an emission reduction, this surely should not also be counted towards an NDC. That would be double counting. But of course, developing rules around this is really complex because now we're looking across not just one, but 2 UN programs. Under 6.4, negotiators were looking at issues related to baselines and additionality, and how those are determined in the context of all countries having commitment under the Paris Agreement. Again, avoiding double counting issues are major for Article 6.4, and this is one of the main barriers to agreement, whether or not 6.4 credits should be covered by accounting rules when they're internationally transferred and used towards NDCs. Another major political issue is the transition of the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms. The issue is generally about methodologies, activities, and units, but the most contentious of these 3 is the carryover units from the Kyoto Protocol, not just those from the CDM and JI, but also those created under the KP targets, AAUs, those are called. The overarching issues include, and I mean by overarching issues that impact both 6.2 and 6.4, is the levy of a share of proceeds to fund adaptation. So the need for adaptation finance is clear, and 6.4 explicitly calls for a levy to contribute to adaptation finance, but Article 6.2 is silent on the matter. This is a really important and massively political issue in the Article 6 negotiations. The overall mitigation and global emissions, which is again explicitly called for in 6.4, but not in 6.2. And there's disagreement amongst parties about how this will be operationalized, and it's a really key issue for some groups of parties. And finally, you have overarching issues related to the governance of Article 6. How much UN supervision versus how much party competence is always an issue in the balance. You can go to the next slide. So I guess the question is, where did we end up with all these issues in Madrid? The bad news is that there was no agreement on Article 6, as you know, but it wasn't for lack of trying. I think COP25 set a record for length, went well into the Sunday. The good news is that most of the technical issues for 6.4 were actually resolved if we can maintain that text. So the final text that we got from the presidency on 6.2 is a really robust basis for international cooperation through carbon markets. And I think other good news is that we've sort of separated the wheat from the chaff. We've managed to hive off most of the highly technical issues so that parties can focus on the key political issues where views are entrenched. These issues, breakthroughs on these, will require political rather than technical effort. I think it's clear to say. And I think the main issues are accounting for the 6.4 mechanism, where there's just different worldviews amongst parties, the transition of the Kyoto Protocol units, the levy of a share of proceeds for adaptation, and overall mitigation and global emissions. You can go to the next slide. So what does this mean going forward? What happens now? Just as an aside, almost, the lack of agreement at Madrid does have some implications for the International Civil Aviation Organization's CORSIA, the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. ICAO is taking some important decisions in the coming weeks about which offset programs and which emission reduction units will be eligible under CORSIA's first phase. Sadly, we didn't help them very much in Madrid by failing to reach agreement. But I think it's clear in the absence of agreed Article 6 rules, ICAO will go ahead with guidance for CORSIA, and that's expected in the coming weeks. Because the two negotiations are connected, some of the decisions that ICAO might take will probably clear a path for agreement on Article 6 at COP26. You know, there's a real chicken and egg situation between CORSIA and the UN. So if they take a decision, it will clear a path for some of those decisions. I think the thing I really want to emphasize, and Elliot emphasized it in his opening remarks, is that failure to reach agreement on Article 6.2 does not prevent international cooperation through carbon markets. In Paris, in 2015, parties made sure that the agreement would not prevent linking or other forms of cooperation. The Paris Agreement very purposely uses the language consistent with guidance rather than pursuant to or in accordance with or taking into account, because parties recognized that international cooperation was already happening and that it would need to be able to continue even in the absence of agreed UNFCCC rules. At COP24 in Katowice, this went a step further, and under the transparency framework, which is at the core of the Paris Agreement, there is a provision, paragraph 77D, which provides a structure to allow countries to count the results of international cooperation towards NDCs while avoiding double counting. Of course, agreement on detailed Article 6 rules would be of great benefit, but it's not a showstopper. Law can follow practice on this one. So pursuing international cooperation now and pressing for international agreement on Article 6 are not mutually exclusive. Often they're presented as mutually exclusive, but they aren't. It's not a plan B versus a plan A. Both plan B and plan A can continue at the same time. Countries can start now in advance of agreement at COP26. And many parties emphasized that they would begin in their closing statements at the COP. In terms of reaching international agreement, COP26 President Claire Perry O'Neill has already indicated that they'll make a big push for agreement at COP26. So both things are currently happening in parallel, and I think that's what needs to happen. Thanks, Elliot.
Thank you, Kelley, for providing an excellent overview of the issues. I think that has probably given everybody a good sense of the technical complexity of the issues, as well as some of the key political issues still before parties, and a sense of where we stand at this juncture looking forward. We'll now hear the first of our country perspectives, Franz Perrez of Switzerland.
Thank you very much, Elliot, for organizing the webinar, and thank you also for allowing me to participate here and share some of our views from Switzerland. I planned to address 5 points. First, a brief comment on the function of the Paris Agreement. Then secondly, on the interests that Switzerland is having on this issue. Thirdly, a short comment on the outcome of Paris. And then fourthly, outlining what could be the next steps, and then concluding with some conclusion as a fifth point. The first point was already well presented by Kelley. I think the most important element is that we have to realize that the Paris Agreement foresees two different mechanism approaches for markets. One is 6.2, the cooperative approach, which can happen and take place without further guidance by the COP, and 6.4, the multilateral mechanism, which can only be implemented and happen if we have some additional COP decisions. So that leads me already to the second point of my presentation here, and that is the interest of Switzerland. Switzerland has formulated an NDC which foresees a reduction by 50% of its emissions by 2030. This is a very ambitious objective, but we have also made very clear that part of that objective will be achieved by using market mechanisms. So we assumed the existence of such mechanisms, that they are available, and we want also to use such mechanisms. We want to contribute to our emission reductions partly through emission reductions outside of the territory of Switzerland. We have launched therefore bilateral negotiations already with a group of countries, with several countries, and we're also confident that we will succeed in having these agreements and these arrangements, these cooperative arrangements in place. So nevertheless, we have a strong interest in rules on Article 6, in strong rules. First of all, we have a strong interest in robust rules on Article 6.4, because if such a multilateral mechanism would be available, that would be much easier, much less burdensome from Switzerland to contribute through markets mechanism to emission reductions, rather than negotiating with partners bilaterally all the different elements, all the conditions, all the rules in order to use Article 6. So Article 6.4 is always more attractive for a country like Switzerland, simply because the transaction costs of achieving emission reductions outside of Switzerland through 6.2 is involving too much transaction costs. So we have an interest in an agreement in robust rules on Article 6.4. Secondly, we also have an interest in robust rules on Article 6.2, not because we need them as Switzerland. In our bilateral agreements, which we are trying to conclude, we are including all these elements that have also been addressed in the drafts that have been discussed in Madrid. So we are not concerned that our bilateral agreements will not respect the guidance from a Paris agreement. But we are concerned that not all partners might be in the same position, that not all countries might apply the same strict standards like Switzerland on baseline setting, on accounting, on ensuring integrity, and so on. And therefore, we would like to have robust rules that would also be legally binding for all the partners that are engaging in 6.2 activities. That is the interest of Switzerland, and that's the reason why we were hoping really to get agreement on this in Madrid. At the same time, of course, for us, it's absolutely critical that we do not agree on rules that weaken Paris, on rules that are not ensuring environmental integrity, that do not ensure the avoidance of double counting, and that are not promoting sustainable development. And that leads me now to the outcome of Madrid. I think in part, Madrid obviously did not deliver what we had hoped for. And we were also very disappointed. We knew that it would be very difficult to get a good outcome of Madrid. We were prepared for an outcome, for a non-outcome, but during the lead up to Paris and during the 2 weeks in Paris, in Madrid, we had the impression that we might be able to agree on a good outcome. And now, of course, the fact that we were not able to do so was clearly disappointing for us. At the same time, it is also clear we are glad that we did not agree on rules that would have created loopholes to the Paris rules. That we did not agree on rules that are not following clearly the key elements of the Paris Agreement. Madrid did not deliver on the multilateral rules to implement Article 6, but it did nevertheless deliver certain elements. It delivered, for example, the San Jose principles, which was referred to also by Kelley. And in these principles, a group of countries, more than 30, have indicated that they will apply robust accounting rules, that they will apply the standards that are needed in order to ensure environmental integrity, avoid double counting, and so on. And that is a positive signal, nevertheless, because it sets a standard, it sets a threshold against what all possible future outcomes will be measured. And thirdly, Madrid also, in addition to that, to this San Jose principle that was supported by a group of countries, thirdly, Madrid also delivered a number of statements of countries, of individual countries, who have indicated that they will apply such rules. Japan has also made very clear that it will, for example, not buy any emission reduction certificates from a time prior to 2020. So did Switzerland. Switzerland has also indicated that until we will be able to agree on rules in the multilateral setting, we will apply the rules as presented by the presidency in their last draft on Article 6.2, which Kelley has referred to, that they are absolutely workable and good rules, and that they could be really applied. So that leads me to the fourth point, the way forward. The way forward includes 3 tracks. The multilateral track on the Paris Agreement, then the more plurilateral approach under the San Jose principle, and then, of course, the continuation of the cooperative approaches under 6.2, bilaterally or a small group of countries. That would be the 3rd track. With regard to the first track, we will certainly try to do everything to get a good outcome in Glasgow at the next COP. At the same time, we will also do everything to avoid adoption of bad rules with regard to accounting, with regard to corresponding adjustment, with regard to transition and carryover, and with regard to adaptation financing, the issues that were so difficulty to find solutions for in Madrid. I think it will not be too difficult to avoid adoption of bad rules. We have been able to do so in Katowice, we have been able to do so in Madrid, and we will certainly also be able to do so in Glasgow. But I think it will be quite difficult to agree on good rules. My impression was that in Madrid, we were very close to an agreement. And there were some factors that made it impossible at the end to agree. But I think we were close to agreement. I think an agreement might have been possible if some things might have happened differently a little bit. And that's not necessarily perfect for Glasgow, because the reasons why we were not getting to agreement might also lie with interests that are outside of that Article 6. In Glasgow, we will not only focus on Article 6, we will also focus on financing, we will focus on transparency, and there is a risk that Article 6 rules could be used even more than in Madrid as a bargaining tool, as a tool to get something more out of another negotiation track. And in this context, it might be more difficult to get a good outcome agreement on robust rules in Glasgow. We will try to get there, but I'm not sure whether it will be easier than in Madrid. So that leads me to the second track, the plurilateral track on the San Jose principle. We think that this track should also be continued, that participation, engagement in favor of the San Jose principle should hopefully be expanded over the next month. Some elements might still have to be added, like the human rights, which are not yet reflected, the protection of human rights in the San Jose principles. And thirdly, we should try to make these San Jose principles more concrete, to agree within the countries, between the countries who are supporting this principle, how we would put them into operation. And we believe that, for example, the last text that the presidency was presenting in Madrid on 6.2 could be a very good starting point, and it would be very nice and very attractive if a group of countries over this year could agree on how they would operationalize Article 6.2 as long as no multilateral agreement has been achieved on the rules. And the third track, that is the bilateral track, the track of concrete cooperative approaches. This will also be a track that Switzerland will continue. We'll continue to work with our partners, and we hope to agree and conclude several agreements this and next year, so that for us at least, Switzerland will be ready to use Article 6.2 in the future, even if you would not be able to agree on common rules under Article 6.2. This is not too bad, because we have, as Kelley has indicated, already in place some elements of the transparency regime. So other partners, other countries who will engage in activities under 6.2 will have to report about that. So there will be a certain transparency linked to these activities. And if many others are doing, like Switzerland, concluding robust bilateral agreements, we are also going to set certain standards for the future. Having said this, I think there's also a fourth track, which is broader than the Paris Agreement context. Market mechanisms are not only important in the context of the Paris Agreement in order to help countries to achieve their NDCs and to contribute to emission reductions over the globe. They are also important for mechanisms like CORSIA, or perhaps ones under IMO, or for private actors who would like to become carbon neutral. So there is, of course, a space also for such activities of a global carbon market, but I'm convinced the more rules that are offered by the Paris Agreement that could be used by such markets, the better. But if we are not able to agree on such rules in the Paris context, I'm convinced that these other markets will evolve nevertheless. That leads me to the conclusions. First, I think it is critical and crucial that we ensure that any future rules ensure environmental integrity, that they ensure robust accounting and avoid double counting, and that they promote sustained development, including the protection of human rights. We will be able to avoid rules that do not respect these principles, but it might be difficult to agree on rules that respect these principles. Secondly, I think we have to aspire to have robust rules, and that ensure that at least in the plurilateral context, that number of countries start to apply such rules that ensure these three elements. And thirdly, the bilateral track on the 6.2 of cooperative approaches will work, and it will grow. And I'm absolutely confident that this track will deliver also benefit for the whole system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Franz, for a very clear presentation, including some very concrete ideas on the possibility of a plurilateral path. Just a reminder to everyone, we will be fielding questions after the final presentations, but you can begin submitting them now by clicking on the question mark icon on your control panel. So now we will hear the second of our country perspectives, Mandy Rambharos from South Africa.
Thank you, Elliot. Can you all hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. So I must say it's really great following Kelley and Franz, because I don't have to say much more, except maybe to nuance some of the things where Franz spoke about what happened in Madrid. But so I'm basically going to address three areas. One is why international carbon markets are important. I know this question comes up a lot, very particularly in response to developing country participation. What are our top three priorities with respect to Glasgow and Article 6 rules? And how do we see international cooperation proceeding, pending whether we get agreement in Glasgow or not? So I think in terms of, I think we've, for those people that have been involved in Article 6 for a long time, it's very clear that international carbon markets are important to quite a few of the large developing countries, and that's particularly because of the investment that happens due to carbon markets. So you might argue that investment can happen regardless, which is true, but what happens when you have the carbon market, it does give you an incentive to move away from business as usual and does enable further private sector investment. For some of the smaller developing countries, it's also a vehicle for additional revenue streams, and it's not just so it's not just development financing, but the fact that you have this innovative, attractive tool or mechanism that can bring investments into the countries. Very importantly as well is contribution to adaptation financing. So you would be familiar that the carbon market was the only stable source of adaptation financing in the past, and that is why it was quite a controversial issue to resolve in Madrid. And then contribution to NDC. So the innovation I spoke of, sustainable development, also assisting countries to meet their NDCs. So all of those issues are quite important in terms of why the interest in carbon markets. And I think particularly from an African perspective, emissions are not high in African countries, as you know. So the whole issue around contribution to adaptation financing and contribution to innovation and sustainable development is a key aspect, which Kelley also highlighted in her overview slides. So what are the priorities with respect to Article 6 rules? Personally, I think COP26 is our last chance to get this right in terms of the rules and the agreement. I don't think anyone is insane enough to try again after that. So it is something we have to get right at this COP. For me, I would say three priorities, which are accounting, accounting, and accounting. So Kelley raised the whole issue around accounting and 6.4 accounting in her overview slides. So I won't go through the background, but just to say that the carbon market has received a bad reputation, I think, over the last few years, but even quite at the beginning, we had quite a lot of opposition to the carbon market due to the credibility. Even now, when you read the press, when you read the media following Madrid, there was a lot of criticism of whether the carbon market actually delivers credibility. So I think if we get the accounting wrong, we just further that view or that perception of carbon markets. So we have to have credible carbon markets, no double counting. That undermines the integrity of the market. I think that is one of the key things we could not agree on in Madrid, and nothing that will undermine demand. So demand, as you know, for those people involved in the carbon market, there's very little demand at the moment. And if you have anything undermining demand any further, so lack of ambition or very weak targets, it will really, again, impact on the credibility of the market. And one such issue is the use of pre-2020 credits. So this was another issue that was quite controversial in Madrid, another issue that led to us not agreeing on weak rules. So that, particularly from our perspective, transition of pre-2020 credits is really something that's difficult to overcome. Franz did mention that we got close in Madrid to an agreement, which countries had to show flexibility on some of these things. So I do think we would have to trade off certain views, yes, but as long as we're not trading system integrity and ambition in both mitigation and adaptation, then I do think we stand a chance. There is the issue around certainty as well, when what happens to the transition of existing CDM projects and activities. This is quite a huge concern for many developing countries because there are a lot of CDM projects and activities in the pipeline that you do not want to lose. So we need some certainty regarding that transition. But just to be clear, I'm speaking of CDM projects and activities that will also have to pass any rules or thresholds that we decide on under Article 6 and not units. So just the projects and activities. I do think, you know, the speakers before me spoke about how close we came to agreement in Madrid. And I really personally, maybe I was too invested, but I personally felt that we could have had agreement. But there were many issues outside of Article 6 that impacted on us actually coming to an agreement in Article 6, which Franz also alluded to. And this is what I keep saying to people is that I don't ignore the interconnectedness of everything, but Article 6 cannot solve the problems with other parts of the negotiations. So I do think that in Glasgow, it's extremely important to address the general issue of financing, where there was a lot of unhappiness, especially with regards to adaptation financing and certainty. The ambition question, this is the ambition COP. We can't solve the ambition question through Article 6. That needs to be resolved. And therefore, I think the share proceeds and overall mitigation global emission components must also be resolved, because these speak directly to each other, but it did hamper the discussions on Article 6 in Madrid, in the fact that we didn't have much traction in the areas of financing, adaptation financing, and ambition in other parts of the negotiations. So how do we see this proceeding if we don't have rules or pending what happens in Glasgow? I think, like others have said, international cooperation can continue and will continue regardless, especially under 6.2. We're already seeing this happening. There are many countries that have already started working on pilots and working on other projects bilaterally and even multilaterally with MDBs in some cases. So this agreement, not reaching rules on the agreement, basically hampers 6.4 more than anything else. And you heard the previous speaker say how important 6.4 is, not just to developing countries, but it's seen as a more attractive mechanism in many respects from other developed countries as well. Kelley mentioned 77D. For some, this is 77D is not seen as robust enough because it speaks to reporting and not accounting. So I think, although international cooperation can continue and will continue and is continuing, there, of course, the risks of differing rules will develop. There's no guarantee that all projects are as credible as, or the credits are as credible as other projects. So not to say, I'm not saying that countries will not develop credible rules, but the playing field will not be level. And this may potentially lead to distorted distribution of projects. And we don't actually know whether we are reducing emissions. So all of these risks play a role in not having these multilaterally agreed rules. I think if we want to meet all of the stuff we decided overall in Paris, then we must agree rules for Article 6. There's already the slippery slope that the carbon market is on, and it'll just get more slippery and more difficult to navigate in the absence of rules. So it is important that we have rules so that we can have a level playing field, so that we are more certain of the credibility of the carbon market so that we don't play into the critics of the carbon market. But I think it's it won't be easy in Glasgow, but considering how close we got in Madrid, I do think it's very, very possible. So like I said earlier, there are certain trade-offs we would have to agree. We discussed these trade-offs in Madrid, we came close to it. Hopefully countries won't backtrack, and we will spend this year trying to get, trying to reestablish some of those flexibilities and trade-offs we did discuss. I do think it's a shorter time period, though. If the COP is the beginning of November, we really have a lot of work to do in the next few months. And also considering that the middle session is in June. So between June and November is very little time if you actually think about it. So I do think it's something we really need to get on our bicycles and work on to get to some agreement. Thanks, Elliot. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mandy, for bringing in another country perspective and for introducing some thoughts on the potential risks and complications we face in the evolving carbon market in the absence of agreed Article 6 rules. With that, I'm going to introduce our final speaker to offer a private sector perspective on these issues, Dirk Forrester of AIDA.
Elliot, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thanks,
Great.
Dirk.
So I'm going to use a few slides here, but I'll try to bring a bit of perspective from the business community about why this set of activities means so much to us. And I'll do that showing some of our views on policy and also just some economic analysis that we've been up to on this topic. So let's go ahead to the next slide. I think increasingly businesses are grappling with what net zero means to them. And this is a concept embedded in the Paris Agreement as part of the efforts to get well below 2 degrees and aiming towards 1.5 degrees centigrade, that level of protection. And I think for many in the business community, just like countries, they're stepping up with their own plans for what it would mean for them to get to net zero. When you think about it at a country level, we think it's going to involve these NDCs continuing to strengthen, go economy-wide, and ultimately decline to net zero. And that means that net word is extremely important, because at the end of that period, if we're looking at it 2040 or 2050, there will still be emissions in certain sectors that will remain. And that means that removals are going to play an even more important role. And that's both from nature and from technological sequestration. And when you look around the world right now, the opportunities for really doing removals at scale are not equally distributed. So not every country has the same access to underground storage sites or to large land masses for soil sequestration or great forests. So ultimately, Article 6 has to be up to the task of bringing all of this together. It'll help us on the pathway to getting there in many respects, but it's really going to be essential if the Paris Agreement is going to work. So if anybody asks you what's important for the success of Paris, if we're actually going to achieve it, the two things that matter the most are Article 6, the transfer system, and making removals work. So the work on technology and on nature-based solution. So what is it that business is looking for in Article 6? Let's go to the next slide. I think this is our take on that same set of issues, and something that AIDA pulled together, I think, in advance of Katowice. We rallied a lot of other business groups to support these same ideas, but basically, I think this pretty much jives with what the other three speakers have said. We want guidance on 6.2 that's clear on the metric, form, and scope of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. We want to understand the relation between ITMOs and the originating parties NDC. That means the accounting that Mandy was stressing, and that we want the accounting methods for ITMOs and the rules for corresponding adjustments to be crystal clear, so that you actually know how to accomplish a corresponding adjustment in a really simple and pragmatic way. And the reason for that is that, in a sense, not only can businesses have confidence, but more importantly, that the governments that are using these systems have confidence in them and embrace them. 6.4 is a slightly different animal embedded within the article, but I think it's the biggest loser out of Katowice and Madrid, in that it needs an ability. I'm getting an echo. And so the 6.4 mechanism actually needs to be stood up and have a board appointed and have guidance from the parties on what additionality is going to mean in this new context. It needs to have clarity about the types of activities that are going to be eligible under it, and really has to have the same, in our view, have the same requirement for corresponding adjustment. I think we've been open to some kind of a transition period for that, but ultimately it also needs to be accountable. Otherwise, you think you're making progress and you aren't. And I know as we've studied this some economically, it's kind of like if you let it be too easy to accomplish additionality, or if you allow what Franz would have described as a loophole for countries not to have to make corresponding adjustments for reductions that are originated in their jurisdiction, you might think you're making progress, but you actually make your job harder later because the atmosphere isn't really seeing those reductions. So we want pretty much a seamless system here. The same applies to the transition of the existing mechanisms. I like the distinction that Mandy made about the old units versus old projects, because there are lots of projects that have not actually had an opportunity to come to market. I think out of 8,000 something projects, less than 3,000 have ever issued a ton. So there's well over 5,000 projects in the CDM pipeline that are spread around developing countries, and a lot of them in Africa, that have not actually had a chance to come to market. And we think there ought to be sort of an openness to that, as long as they can qualify with the new rules. So this is a little bit of our take that I hope is pretty much in sync with what Kelley described for EDF, and Franz for Switzerland, and Mandy for South Africa, that this is pretty much a system that you could have confidence in and you could invest significantly around. So I want to talk a little bit about, again, why we think it's so important related to what Article 6 is worth. So let's go to the next slide. Some of you may have seen some of this work before, but IETA commissioned some research with support from a number of governments and businesses and other NGOs to understand the economic value of Article 6. And we worked with the University of Maryland and their global change assessment model, which has been used in all of the IPCC reports over the years. And they basically, this slide shows how they modeled what the current NDCs mean if they sort of extend them out across the century. This is not a 2-degree compliant world, incidentally. This is just what the existing commitments, if they were followed through on and held steady, and you know, the rates of decline continued as envisioned in those NDCs. And if you look at that, the spaghetti diagram to the right, you'll see that the pricing is all over the place if you impute a price associated with that level of ambition. The high being the EU 15 at about $209 per ton at the end of the century. And some of them, I think that's Pakistan, bumping along the bottom at $0 per ton for a number of decades until about mid-century it starts to become meaningful. And if you actually allow these to be achieved together through a market-based approach, if you allowed trading amongst all of these and you sought to achieve the same level of ambition, you could cut the cost more than in half. So in the 2030 timeframe, it would be reducing it from that spread of 0 to 100 down to $38 per ton, and by the end of the century, $107 per ton. Now, this is just with the sort of technology side. This is not including nature-based solutions, and we wanted to understand that as well. So let's look at the next slide. I think the next one actually just summarizes a bit on the mitigation side, what could happen if you actually reinvested all of those savings, both on the host country side and the sponsor country side. How much more mitigation could you achieve for the same level of investment? So you don't pocket the savings, you reinvest it. And for this, their model showed that you could achieve another 5 gigatons per year by 2030. Reason that's significant, and I think, Kelley, this is consistent with EDF's modeling on this, but if the reason it's significant is that the existing NDCs only get around 9 or 10 gigatons by that time. So you're actually adding about 50% in terms of the mitigation potential. But the story gets even more impressive when you add nature-based solutions. So let's go to that next slide. And in this summary slide just sort of shows that if you actually add in nature-based solutions, it would provide an additional 70 billion a year in savings, bringing the combined savings up to 320 billion per year. This is globally, obviously. But it would also unleash an additional 4 gigatons per year of mitigation potential, bringing that number up to 9. So it really shows that if Article 6 worked, and if nature-based solutions worked and other removals, then by 2030 we could be doubling the ambition without additional cost. Now this is let's move ahead to the next slide. This is obviously academic, right? This is not the reality. This is what a model would show is possible, but it really illustrates why this effort is so important. And one of the key lessons in it, as you look across the different regions, is, obviously some are selling and some are buying, but in those types of trades, both sides benefit. So in fact, this model shows that through these scenarios, everyone would be better off at the end of the day through cooperation. They show the mitigation costs could be reduced by as much as 320 billion in 2030, and it grows to over $1 trillion per year by the end of the century. And then finally, that this enhanced mitigation could bring you an additional 9 gigatons a year. This is something we're exploring now. As if that's what's possible with perfection, what might we get with more imperfect scenarios? Really looking at, Franz, some of the elements that you outlined of different forms of cooperation. So we're going to do analysis this year on club formation, and what if you had a high ambition club that's much like Franz described, of countries that want to work together and set high standards, and how much of this mitigation potential could you achieve through smaller groupings? So we'll have more to share on that as the year progresses. Let's go to I think I've got one more slide maybe, or yeah. So again, this is theoretical potential, but at the end of the day, the rules do matter on making this all achievable. And completely agree with Mandy. COP26 in Glasgow, I think, is our last great chance to get global understanding on this. If not, cooperation will continue because it's going to be essential in making Paris succeed. It just will not be as smooth as it could be with clarity on the rules at the outset. Secondly, and I'm really glad that both Mandy and Franz alluded to this, just having the rules on Article 6 isn't good enough. You actually need to know how countries plan to use it if you're a company wanting to invest. And this year, I hope we start to get a lot more clarity on this. I hope we see more pilots. I hope we see the the San Jose declaration countries coming together around those principles and talking about how they might be able to jumpstart something. Because if you're in the world of project development, and probably a number of people on the call have done that, have made investments in projects or have developed projects to bring through the Kyoto mechanisms or some of the voluntary market mechanisms, you know that it takes time. It can take 18 months to 2 years sometimes to get a methodology approved, and then a project approved, and then a project financed and implemented. Sometimes that's 3 years. And we simply don't have enough time, particularly if we're going to meet the CORSIA demands that are coming much sooner than that. So I think it's time for countries to begin outlining what their plans are for how they're going to use it. And you can use Article 6.2 without the 6.4 mechanism by embracing some of the voluntary standards like VERA or that runs the VCS, or the ACR standards, or Climate Action Reserve. The Canadian Standards Association runs standards. There's just a variety of them around the planet, the gold standard. So they're tools to use with 6.2 that don't depend on 6.4 getting completed. And I think we kind of need to accelerate work on that if we're actually going to be able to deliver the scale of reductions that are needed for meeting the Paris goals. And finally, I think that the most important point in this year of ambition and wanting countries to step up ambition in their next NDCs, Article 6 and the understanding of whether it's available is going to, or whether it's available in a way you want it to be available, is going to be essential to countries pledging something. If you don't think it's going to work, and we kind of know what targets might look like, because when countries put forward their Paris targets, they didn't know if there was going to be an Article 6 or not. There aren't that many Switzerlands who put forward an ambitious target that intended to use markets, and we need to see more of those. So this is going to be a critical year for that, and having confidence in Article 6 will relate to that ambition quest. So with that, Elliot, thanks, and I'll stop and look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Dirk, in particular, for underscoring in very concrete terms the importance of Article 6 in terms of achieving cost reduction, but even more importantly, in terms of enhancing ambition and increasing the prospects of achieving the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. We have just about 30 minutes left, so we're going to start fielding questions. Many have come in already. Anyone else who'd like to submit a question, please use the click on the question mark icon on your control panel, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Going to start with a couple of questions related to the San Jose principles. This one was directed to Franz, but I think anyone should feel free to field it. The question is, could Switzerland see the San Jose principles developing over time into a club of like-minded acquiring and transferring countries? And a similar question from another viewer, any ideas on how to broaden the number of countries committing to the San Jose principles? So again, I put that first to Franz, but then to anyone else who'd like to jump in.
Thanks, Elliot, and thanks also for these questions. The San Jose principles were not aimed at creating a club for countries that want to interact with each other and to trade with each other. The San Jose principles were aimed at formulating what do we countries expect from the multilateral rules to be adopted by under the Paris Agreement. So they were targeted towards the COP, and I think that is their main function. And that was Costa Rica started to work on them already during the pre-COP, and then continued also towards the COP. So that is their main function, to formulate clearly what do we need in order to ensure environmental integrity, robust accounting, avoidance of double counting, and promotion of sustainable development. However, these principles, I think, provide a frame under which parties could become more concrete. Members that have supported the San Jose principles could put them more into operation by translating these general principles into a legal text, indicating how would that have to be translated into a legal text if you would want to reflect them. And if this is going to be happening, then the countries could also commit to use these kind of rules if they engage in cooperative approaches. And that does not only have to happen with other partners supporting the San Jose principle, that could also happen with parties that have not yet supported them, but it would certainly set an international standard. It is obvious, of course, that if you're looking for a partner and you know that there are certain numbers of partners who have already agreed to the same standard, then of course it is easier, it reduces transaction costs to cooperate with these partners. But the San Jose principles are not intended to create an exclusive club that would allow cooperative approaches only between these members.
And any thoughts, Franz, on how to increase the number of countries signing on to the principles?
Well, I think the best way to agree that is to talk about them so that everybody knows them. I had today talk with Costa Rica, and I think one of the clear message from their side is also they would like also to expand the membership there. Things were hectic in Madrid, and I think not everybody did have the time to look at these principles. So the best way to do that is to talk about them and to explain them, and to also explain the benefit of these principles. And if countries know about them more, they might also join.
Anyone else want to come in on these questions? Okay, then a related question, and this one I will pose to you, Kelley. How closely does the final text that emerged in Madrid correspond to the San Jose principles?
That's a good question. I mean, the difficulty is, of course, that the San Jose principles are principles. And the text is legal text, but I think fairly closely. I mean, Mandy and Franz, you both know those quite well as well, but I can't think of, I'm going through it in my head, I can't think of major missing elements. Of course, it would be 6.2 and 6.4. Yeah, I think very, very closely. And it depends on how you wanted to see some of the elements implemented, right? So because the San Jose principles are established at a principled level, there is still devil in the detail. So when it comes to share of proceeds, there may be a particular percentage or operational way you wanted to see that implemented that isn't consistently applied in 6.2 and 6.4, but generally that principle is managed. But maybe Mandy or Franz, you could speak to where they might be different. I think generally the 6.2 text very much satisfies those. If we can, it's not an agreed text, if we could hold on to the final presidency text, that is.
Yeah, I could just jump in here as well. I think if you look at the final presidency text, it's pretty close. I think it's what you and Franz both said, that the San Jose principles are principles and not legal text. So, you know, you would have to then sift through what legal text would look like compared to the principles. So on most areas, I think there is alignment. The San Jose principles do prohibit the use of pre-2020 credits though. Whereas in the final presidency text, there is some flexibility on transition of pre-2020 credits. So there was some language looking to sort of allow a transition period for pre-2020 credits. So that's one area of major disagreement or misalignment, I would say. But most of the other areas are pretty well aligned, and I think it speaks very well to that. You see a lot of the sentiments in the San Jose principles coming out in that last last bit of text that came out of the presidency.
Sorry, Elliot, I'll just jump back in because I think I did answer on the basis of a caveat. And I think Mandy's just brought up a really important point. So the 6.2 text was quite clean and is a robust basis, but a lot of the difficult issues, including transition, are in the 6.4 text. And you're right, because the San Jose principles cover both 6.2 and 6.4, I think you would have to look across both texts to find the consistency. And that transition of KP units is one place where we definitely see some difference. And then I think, you know, as Mandy said earlier, and I love that accounting. There was an effort in the 6.4 text to find some compromises on whether or not you have to account for 6.4. And it does say that you have to account, but it also leaves open the door for sort of a process or a work program or for parties to consider how that applies to them. And I don't think that would be consistent with the San Jose principles. in the strictest sense. So the 6.4 text maybe needs some work, but I think those are also just the areas we highlighted where you had entrenched views. Most of those entrenched views, well, no, half of them are in the 6.4 text. So it's sort of difficult.
Let me just come in on that. That's Franz as well. Our understanding is also that the 6.2 text is pretty well putting flesh to the San Jose principles. When it comes to 6.4, Mandy, you were referring to the provision of use of pre-2020 units, also the elements how we deal with non-CO2 based metrics. There, the San Jose principles were probably more ambitious, and someone said in the presentation we need at the end also some compromises, but these compromises have need to ensure still the integrity of the whole outcome. So the 6.4 text included some brackets, and it did send some elements to work programs and also some elements that were part of the San Jose principles. But in short, I agree that the 6.2 text probably is pretty in line with the San Jose principles, and the 6.4 text would need certainly some further work.
So staying with the theme for the moment of compromises, this question is for Mandy or anyone else. Can you go into detail on what the Article 6 trade-offs were in Madrid and what you would be willing to compromise in Glasgow to forge an agreement?
Okay. How much time do we have? I think, so if I talk about the trade-offs and the compromises, I'm not necessarily speaking about what we were willing to trade off or compromise personally, but what we saw from other countries and what was going on in the negotiations, as many of you saw in any case. But I think so exactly the issue we were just talking about, which is the transition of pre-2020 credits. Pretty strict red line for most countries, but towards the end we did notice that there was some flexibility in terms of, can we put a time limit to it, can we put a volume limit to the transition of pre-2020 credits, but it wasn't just pre-2020 credits on its own. It was, what is the package around accounting? Do we give on both transition of pre-2020 credits and on double counting, which is not accounting for some of the 6.4 accounting that we just spoke about throughout this past hour. So it was, many countries felt we can't give on both. So can we put some time limits and can we put some volumes on it? But I think the language around can we put some time limits and volumes is already flexibility, because it was a red line for many countries that we don't have transition of pre-2020 credits. There was also some, when we had those informal little fishbowl discussions in the negotiations, there was a lot of movement around how do we word adaptation financing. So if you remember, many sessions back, it was a complete red line to have any mention of adaptation funding or financing under 6.2. 6.4 is a given. 6.2, there was very much reluctance to include anything. So the fact that in the last text, at the last presidency text, that we have a section that refers to adaptation financing, strongly encourages countries, although for many countries it wasn't strong enough, it was actually a flexibility or a movement from a position of nothing at all. So those were, I think, for me, some of the main movements, some of the main areas of flexibility that played out, and that's probably the areas we need to focus on to resolve this year to get that agreement. Like the previous speakers have said, we mostly in 6.2 text, we've mostly achieved quite a lot, even though people say, oh, Article 6 again, nothing. But if you look at previous sessions, if you look at previous negotiations and texts, there was actually quite a lot that was achieved in some of those movements on some of those red lines. So that's where we saw a lot of flexibility, I think.
Anyone else want to jump in on that question?
No, just to say I agree with that analysis almost completely, or maybe even totally completely.
This is Franz. Just one addition. I also totally agree with that analysis. And I think it's also important to recognize that we did not apply Rule 16 to Article 6. We, on the contrary, we have transferred these different texts that have emerged as possible compromise from presidency as a basis for the next work, for the work in this year. So that shows, at least for us, that is an indication that we don't have to start at point zero, but that we can build on the work that was done in Madrid, and that we can continue to build on these elements of compromises that started to emerge that Mandy was outlining.
So another question again to anyone who wants to field it. If COP26 is unable to achieve agreement on the Article 6 rules and parties proceed on either a bilateral or a plurilateral basis, how much will that set us back in terms of how many years will that set us back in terms of the development of an eventual global market? Anyone care to pick that one up?
I mean, from our perspective, it would. So it's true that, and Mandy's already outlined it. The first best scenario is if we get agreed international rules, which are good enough. But in the absence of that, we can get agreement on how to proceed amongst a coalition of the willing. Because let's be clear, the entrenched issues are many countries and parties, including those that have indicated the use of international cooperation through carbon markets in their NDCs, agree on these fundamental issues. And so there's no reason that they couldn't go forward on the basis of robust accounting and environmental integrity in the absence of rules. So I'm not sure it has to set us back at all. It's just harder because it takes those countries getting together and agreeing how to proceed in the absence of international rules. But what we've seen in the past through some other initiatives is that if you can establish those rules outside of the UNFCCC, sometimes it clears the way for agreement within the UNFCCC. So those rules which are negotiated outside or set up outside through plurilateral approaches, or as Franz said, even starting with bilateral and broadening it to plurilateral, those can be dropped in. Law can follow practice. And we've seen this in other difficult areas where the difficulty was with a small number of parties and you had a large number of parties agreeing on a lot of the aspects. And I think that could still happen. So the answer is it doesn't have to set us back at all.
I'll add a little bit to that in that I think I actually think there may be good reason to go forward without it rather than accepting unpalatable things. And because if countries aren't confident in the system, they're not going to use it. If it's full of loopholes, they're not going to use it. Whereas if you move forward independently using the 6.2 authority and using 77D, you don't have to buy old credits. You never have to buy the old credits. That big question mark, just kind of the market solves it, because they're out there right now and they're not commanding a very good price because there's not that many places that you can use them for compliance. So I do think that some of those issues, if you move forward in a more of a I guess it would be a vision of coming back to the UN later in 5 years or 10 years, and you follow practice, then a lot of that gets sorted. I think the same is probably true of the questions about how many haircuts do you apply, which is one that really I think is a challenge for those of us in the business community that think that'll be portrayed, particularly in North America, as being a tax on the system at a UN level that makes it a lot more difficult to sell. But again, you could move forward in more bilateral arrangements or plurilateral arrangements that solve that in a pragmatic way of assuring that there's true integrity in the way that credits are being awarded if it's a baseline credit system, or that the caps are tied if it's an allowance system. So I think in some senses you would the losers again are the people that would want to use 6.4 in a massive way. And for some of the countries that I think that matters a lot more to smaller, less developed countries that may have difficulty in establishing their own systems or their own linkages. I think they still have pathways through these other independent standards, but I think the imprimatur of UN, UN rules and UN practices helps them gain access to market. So that's a loss, but if you have larger emitting countries in the developing world that are able to step forward with these other systems, then at least in terms of the large amounts of reduction potential, it tends to be in those bigger places that have big emission sources.
Can I just add there as well? I think Dirk just took the words out of my mouth, because some of the problems that was encountered with the CDM, I think will be exacerbated if we had no rules under Article 6 or no multilaterally agreed rules. And Dirk just pointed out why for the smaller developing countries. So I think I agree with Kelley. It doesn't take us back, but I think the unintended consequence is that you will have countries that are excluded purely based on their capacity or ability to participate, or they might be get involved in pilots and projects where are not necessarily to their best advantage, if you understand what I mean. So I think there would be losers, particularly like Dirk said, for those who would want to use 6.4, or for those who do not have the capacity to get involved in those bilateral arrangements and things like that. So at some level, the multilateral rules are important for smaller countries, but we can't accept bad rules either, generally. So I think it's quite a complex problem, but not insurmountable. I do think we can see a way through to get those rules.
Great, thank you. A couple of you have touched on the intersection, if you will, between issues under negotiation under Article 6 and the issues before ICAO in operationalizing CORSIA, the offsetting mechanism for aviation. ICAO is a very different regime with a very different governance structure. One of our questioners notes that ICAO has appointed a 19-member technical advisory body for help on these issues, and that many of its members are offset experts, many of them with significant CDM experience, which might indicate an openness to use of CDM units, at least to some degree, as offsets under CORSIA. But the technical advisory body, the TAB as it's known, merely provides recommendations, and it's the ICAO Council that will take the ultimate decisions. And the Council, of course, is made up of countries. 9 of the 36 Council countries signed on to the San Jose Principles. So the question is, how do you see this decision-making process on what units should be eligible playing out within ICAO? How much deference will be given to the TAB? And how will consensus likely emerge in the Council? Kelley, I'm wondering if you might take a first stab at that set of questions.
Yeah, I think you've set out the decision-making process quite well. Yes, of course, there are some people with CDM knowledge on the TAB, but I think what you're also going to see on the TAB is a pretty strong cross-section of Article 6 negotiators. So, a step has kind of been missed there. You have a lot of ex-CDM negotiators that are now Article 6 negotiators that are now TAB members. So there's a broad awareness of the issues in terms of these transition issues, which come out as vintage issues in CORSIA, and the implications on their market. And there's an awareness in the TAB and in the Council, and it's been made public, that CORSIA's demand of 2.5 to 3 billion tons through 2035 could be completely eclipsed by pre-2020 units. And given the flight shaming movement, and a growing awareness among airlines, if nothing else, that their climate action is related to their credibility with their customers. I don't think it is in anyone's interest to allow pre-2020 units to completely eclipse all of the reductions achieved through CORSIA. So for that reason alone, and not because of some connection between the TAB and the CDM, I expect that we're going to see a good decision, a good recommendation coming out of the TAB. And hopefully that'll translate into a good decision of the council. In terms of double counting, I think that's more difficult. And that's because it's very difficult for the TAB and the ICAO Council to determine double counting rules in the absence of agreement internationally. So I expect what they'll do is try and break it up, try and take a decision now where they don't have to face the entire international accounting framework, and instead make some determinations about that at a later stage. If they have to, I think they will take decisions about how double counting is operationalized in the context of ICAO, and they absolutely can do that. But obviously it is better if they can rely on an international framework. Not necessary, but probably better.
Any others? Okay, in that case, we have a question that turns to the third provision of Article 6 that Kelley mentioned, but we haven't focused on very much. And this is Article 6.8, which addresses non-market approaches. Can someone tell us where we stand on Article 6.8? Is there something on track for non-market approaches?
Don't all jump up at once, right? So I think 6.8, you know, there was so much focus through the year last year on 6.2 and 6.4 that 6.8 kind of slipped under the radar, in my personal view. Maybe the others don't agree on that. But you know, the biggest issue around 6.8 was around the governance and whether we establish a program or a program with the sunset, or you have an ongoing forum. And so there was some text that was produced in that last iteration where the different options were included. And from discussions in the negotiations, most people seemed comfortable with the 6.8 text. Obviously, there were differing views on how to take the forum or the program or the work program forward, but there was general comfortableness or comfort with the text from what I remember, but I'm not sure if anybody has a different view on that.
Yeah, I think you're right, Mandy. The thing is, 6.8 made a lot of progress in Katowice, and 6.8 has a lot less detail and a lot less of these contentious issues. And so there was a massive effort by New Zealand and Chile in particular to come to an agreement on 6.8 in advance of COP24 in Katowice. That text has remained pretty stable. The other thing, and it's just, Mandy, as who continues to be a negotiator, probably can't be as frank on this, but the truth is 6.8, you know, it was always part of a package of agreement because we had serious proponents of 6.8, and those proponents of 6.8 tended to be anti-market, right? So 6.8 has the potential to become a lot of things, right? It's quite open in its drafting. It can become something exciting or maybe not at all. What we always knew, it was part of the package to get agreement on 6.2 and 6.4. Those proponents have been less active this year, so everybody's happy with a stable text. Of course, if that starts rearing its head again, the dynamic is that we have to get this agreed as a package. So that's part of it too. I mean, 6.8 is a decision on a framework towards a framework for non-market, a decision on a work program for a framework for non-market approaches. It's quite open. It can become many things.
And I think I think, Kelley, that's probably one of the big distinctions that, unless you're really deep into this, you wouldn't necessarily see, is that it is a work program as opposed to trying to set up a mechanism. Like 6.4, you have to have a board, you have to have some criteria for what's going to get awarded, you have additionality, you got all those kind of things. Whereas I think what's envisioned here is a few steps upstream of that is actually just defining a work program of how to further understand what all is included in it. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
We are almost
Sorry,
out of time.
Elliot.
Sorry,
Can I
go
just
ahead.
yeah, I just wanted to add, I absolutely agree with what was just said, but Kelley makes a very important point that we should not overlook, is that this is a package. So if we don't get that final agreement on 6.8 and how those proponents see it going forward, then we won't get any of Article 6. So I think that's also very important not to forget when we're in Glasgow.
That's right. And as long as it stays stable, we're in good shape. But if those proponents change their minds, and this is one of the risks about not getting agreement in Madrid, because if new things arise there, then it becomes very much part of the package, part of the negotiations, I mean.
So I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question for Franz, but I have to ask you to be brief in your response. Can you speak to Switzerland's existing progress in sourcing carbon credits under its bilateral agreements? And how smoothly could those bilateral agreements be applied to private sector demand in other markets such as Corsia?
Thanks. I tried to be very briefly. We're advancing with our BAT agreements, but that indicated the transaction costs are quite big because we have to solve all these technical issues that we hoped that the Paris rules would solve through bilateral agreements. And many of our partners, for them, it's new territory because they have not yet engaged on this kind of thinking. So we are advancing, and we are trying to formulate these agreements in a manner that the ITMOs that are created under these bilateral agreements could also be used for other activities than achievement of NDCs. So that these agreements would establish a framework under which ITMOs could be created, corresponding adjustment would take place, and they could be used also for other purposes. So in theory, these ITMOs could be used for other demands like Corsia. But of course, these few bilateral agreements will never be sufficient in order to satisfy all the demand of, for example, Corsia.
Great. Well, thank you for that brief response, Franz, and thanks to all of you for some excellent presentations and some really rich discussion. I want to thank all of those who've been listening in and submitting questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of the questions. Please keep an eye out for announcements of future webinars. More are coming. And just as a reminder, if you're interested in joining us in Detroit, March 4th through 6th, for our annual Climate Leadership Conference, you can get more details about that at climateleadershipconference.org. Thanks again all for joining us, and have a good day.